Hi, everyone. I think we'll wait for a couple minutes and see uh, if other people arrive, and then we'll get started. Jorge, did you get my email? Would that be possible?
Hi, teacher. Yes, I have just received the email, so I'm going to share with the students as soon as possible, right?
Yeah, if you don't mind waiting until we're through the first section, and then email it. I'll just tell you when, if that's fine.
Okay, teacher.
Okay.
Thank you.
No, thank you. Appreciate it. So if there are at least some people here, it'd be great to just take a couple minutes to say hello, and maybe tell me one or two things that you're interested in, work-wise or intellectually. So if that sounds fine, it would be helpful in orienting me and the material that I present, because obviously I had slightly mistaken idea of what you all were focused on. Juan Camilo, are you there?
Hi, teacher.
Hi.
I found interesting about what are you talking about. I don't have any comments about how to guide your presentations. I feel okay the way you are taking the course. Thank you.
Okay, and your international relations, is that right?
Excuse me?
Is your work in international relations?
No, I am actually working in a guild. It's an union of builders in the north coastal of Colombia, in Cartagena, actually.
Oh, wow.
I'm working here during the last 4 years. So I work as a training coordinator and other topics in the guild.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, great. Glad to have you here. And what about Nicolas? Are you there?
Yeah, teacher, good morning. How are you?
I'm okay. I just wanted to know if you can say a couple of words about yourself and the kind of things you're interested in intellectually, maybe what your background is research-wise.
Okay, so you want that I talk about myself?
Yeah, just what your field is and what you're most interested in terms of the course.
Okay, 2 years ago, more or less, I took a class called International Migrations. And I found, or I got interested in this topic. I really like. And I also like refugees topic. I think that it's an interesting topic, and now actually in this globalization world. And I'm studying international relations. I work 6 months with Comando General de las Fuerzas Militares here in Colombia. And I work at the table or the negotiations or preparations between Colombia, Canada, and USA. Okay. And also I was part of the USCAP plan. I don't know if maybe you know, but USCAP is the plan when the USA give us money and we teach the other places, the other cities in the region to teach strategies, fight with the narco traffic, security, peace, defense, and other topics related to forces. And now that's what I do, and I really love migration and cooperation topics.
Yeah, I mean, this question of, best practices and what kinds of organizations are involved, I think this is very much what we will be talking about also today. Mabel, is that how you say it? Are you there? What about Paula?
Hi, teacher.
Hello.
How are you, teacher?
I'm okay.
Well, what I think I'm very interested about the history for India and Europe because I'm working of migration in that moment. So it's very important for me understand about the old progress for ciclo migratorio. I don't know in English.
The migration
cycle?
Yeah.
Yes, teacher. It's very important for me and understand for the old progress. And no more. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that this is something I'm also very interested in. Carlos Andres, are you there?
Yes. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
About myself, well, I'm a student.
Okay.
I am in CPG in 7th semester. I am too interested in knowing about public politics and making it for make public value. So that's my major interest, and that's the view that I want to give to my career.
Okay, great. You can all also feel free to email me if you have questions or suggestions or things that you want to cover. Because I'm actually kind of interested in everything. I'm that kind of intellectual, and so I'm open to a lot of different things. I had a totally different session planned for today. You may have seen. And I changed it last night because I thought this would be more interesting for you. So let's keep the conversation going. Let's take a few more people today, and then we'll continue with sort of this general introduction next week. Juan Sebastian, are you there? What about Sarah? Sarah Suarez. Mariana? Oh, hi, Sarah. Sarah. Okay, a bunch of people are having problems with their connections. Well, let's just keep moving. If you're able to, then do respond. Mariana Valbuena, are you there?
Yes, hello.
Hello.
About me, I'm a student of international relations and science politics. And I'm interested in maybe the history of migrations too, and how these migrations have been development, and I don't know that.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually a critical thing. I think very often in international relations and political science, history is not very central, right? People don't think about it too much. But in migration and human rights law, there is a kind of continual way that that history shapes the reception of migrants and shapes law and exclusion in particular, right? And in my view, absolutely the most central moments in contemporary migration law were created around the mid-century, around the 1950s, because the scale of the migrations at that time were so catastrophic that they shaped the way that nation states and international institutions reacted to migration for a period of 30 or 40 years. And that's only changed in the last 30 years. We're entering a new, what's called new migration regime, one that's defined by, and we'll talk about this today, by what's called, quote unquote, a humanitarian impulse. And so I'm happy to hear that people are interested in history. That's great to hear. How about we do 3 more people if we can? Johanna, I know you had problems with internet yesterday. Are you able to talk? Okay.
Yeah. Hello, teacher. Good morning. Sorry for yesterday, but I was in a meeting, so I can talk a lot.
Great. Well, I love people who can talk a lot. Go ahead.
Okay. So about me, I'm member of the Colombian Army. Right now, I'm working at the borderline between Colombia and Venezuela.
Okay.
And I'm interested in the course because I know that all the attention is right now at the north part or the borderline at the north, Bucaramanga, Cúcuta, all that area.
Okay.
But right now I need to start to building protocols to apply in this area because, you know, all the immigration, it's growing in this area. And so that we need to start to apply all that kind of security, the laws, special laws. That's why I'm interested.
Great. And yeah, if we have some time today, maybe we can, at the end of the session, we can talk in a general way about the contemporary situation in Colombia. I follow it as best I can, but it's a fast changing situation, right? And yeah, okay, great. Thanks, Johanna. Andrea, are you there?
Yeah, good morning. I study international relations. I'm on the last semester, and I actually find interesting, you know, the rise of global migration from the post-war to the present. I would like to talk about maybe human rights or human rights related to immigrants, and maybe the most important institutions that right now, you know, control that aspect.
Okay. Yeah, so what agencies and organizations are playing a critical role in addressing the issues of migrants and particularly refugees? Great. Okay.
Exactly.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you.
Sarai, how are you today? Are you there?
Hi, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, great. So I study political science and government. I am in my 7th semester, and I also am a volunteer in the Fundación Feminicidios Colombia, and it's a foundation that basically cares about femicides in Colombia. So they have like very many departments, like legal one, psychology, the observatory, and I am in the observatory. So I take care of the databases, and we send like a report. It goes to the, I don't know how to say it in English, Fiscalia. And they are the ones who investigate, like the police. They investigate the femicides, and it helps like for the men to be correctly sentenced.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a pretty good work there. I really love it, and I'm very interested on talking about like women inequality and like inequality itself. So not just for women, but also for race and puberty and all that. And yeah, that I told that before to Diego, but I really I would like to be able to like connect migration with inequality for women, because I know that migrants, like who are women, are in a like very higher like vulnerability risk. And yeah, that's it.
No, I think that that is a critical issue, which I haven't worked on, but the difference and the different experiences of women and men in refugee camps, in situations of informal labor or quote unquote illegality. They have very different risks and problems. And so that's a really important issue that we should try and find a way to make central. And I think this is actually critical to what both Johanna and Nicolas were talking about. If one's trying to generate responses and protocols for how to address these issues, one of them must, of course, be to address dangers of, for example, human trafficking and so on and so forth, which are particularly affect women and children, right? And that is, we will actually talk about specifically that today as well. There are actually only 4 or 5 more people. Shall we do it just now? I'd love to, I'm very interested in what you're all saying. So Natalia, if you're there.
Hi, teacher. Hi, everyone. I'm in 6th semester of International Relations.
Okay.
And I'm really interested in this topic because last semester I had the opportunity to take a class about global governance. And one of the topics was migration. So I really like this course because of the fact that here I'm able to learn to understand this issue from history, the causes, the effects, and also because of the policy brief, I'm going to be able to influence the opinions of the decision makers. I'm interested in solutions, in alternatives, and try to improve the life quality of the people. So I'm really excited with this.
Yeah, I'll say very quickly. I mean, today we will talk about international law and about the category of the refugee as a juridical category, and what that means for best practices in both policy terms and in practice. And I think today you'll hear some quite critical perspectives on those, right? You know, there's a lot of discussion of where the gaps are or where it's unsuccessful, but hopefully we can then from there find the places where it is successful or where there's possibilities for change in a positive way. Gerson, is that how you say it? Are you there? I may have said it wrong. Okay, well, what about Maria? Are you there?
Yes, hi.
Morning, Maria.
How are you?
I'm okay.
Okay, so I just graduated from international relations as well, and I'm interested in migration since I took a class about international migrations, and there I studied a little bit about climate refugees.
Climate refugees, environmental refugees, okay.
And I find it very interesting, but semester was over, and yeah, that's why I'm taking this class. And just as a girl previously said, I forgot her name, I'm sorry. The part of public policy I haven't studied quite good, like quite well, so I'm very interested in that. And that's it.
Great, great. Ana Maria, are you there? Okay, all right. Yeah, this is always a problem with the Zoom classes. Hi, morning. Nice to talk to you over the chat anyway. Angelica, are you able to? And then there's somebody calling in from a phone. I don't know your name, but 98129884164. Okay, well, that was a really helpful introduction. Yeah, Juan Camilo.
Fisher, actually, I'm a little bit interested in master plans is based on long run, okay? But migration creates needs for today. Secondly, you need land and a strong housing policy for migration. I know you talk about yesterday, but I would like to know a little bit more about it. It's a big issue in cities, I think, and I'm a little bit interested in that issue, that particular issue, because you need land, you need housing, you need public utilities, you need hospitals, and usually that tend to be a strong investments. Infrastructure is not cheap, and it investments is thinking about long run, but migration creates problems today. So I would like to learn a little bit more about how to face or deal with a situation.
Yes, that is absolutely something that it's an absolutely brilliant point, because otherwise everything is just a fantasy, right? I mean, it's just a humanitarian desire. And then the question is, well, how will you pay for it? Where do you put it? Who will build it? And so on and so forth. So it becomes a very practical problem very quickly. And so there is, in the whole discussion of human rights, international human rights law, there is this whole question about whether you want people to return home, right? So when the situation becomes calm, you want them to go home. And so they are living only in a temporary way in your country, or whether more realistically, you know that if they stay for 2 or 5 or 10 years, that this has become their home, right? And exactly what you're talking about, I think every single one of us should keep this in the back of our minds, what Juan Camilo said. And with that, it's a perfect transition to what I'm going to talk about, because for the first 10 or 15 minutes, I'm just going to go back to what we did in the last session and try and make it clearer, because I had the feeling that maybe it wasn't exactly obvious what I was trying to say. So we'll start with a brief discussion of what happened yesterday, and I'm happy to take questions about this as well. And then we'll move on to some new materials, which I think will be interesting for 2 reasons. I think first, because people in the class will disagree about them. They'll have different opinions. And the second reason is the materials, the 2 readings that I put on the website, the Aulas website. If you haven't read them, that's fine. But they're very good analyses, and they're very good critiques, and they have, to some extent, some productive suggestions, I think, and very radically shifting suggestions. And they come back to a lot of the questions that you guys have so far raised. So that will be the intention, is first to revisit these points. And really, I think they speak exactly to what Juan Camilo was talking about. and then to move forward to talk more conceptually about a range of issues. One more thing, there's a lot of written text in my PowerPoint. So after this first section, I'm going to send the PowerPoint to all of you by email, or rather Jorge will do it. And if you prefer, you can translate it into Spanish if that is easier for you, or you can take more time with the text. But either way, you'll have the material in front of you as well as on the shared screen. So hopefully that'll be helpful. Okay. So first of all, and please just shout out if you have a question, okay? Because I understand that it's for many of you quite different material, and also obviously in a different language. So just stop me and we can take the time that we need. Okay, so very briefly, let me go back to what we were talking about yesterday, okay? The standard explanations of urban growth, right? So when people talk about how cities expand and also contract, they often, and indeed typically, talk about migration, right? So migration, as we all agree, is fundamental. It's a fundamental fact of the city. Now, in the global South, these explanations typically focus on rural urban migration, that is migration from the countryside to cities. And the obvious reason they focus on that and not cross-border migration is that researchers and practitioners don't think anybody wants to migrate to the global South, right? So there's a very problematic assumption in there, right? So anyway, global South migration, global South explanations focus on rural urban migration. And in particular, rapid and quote unquote distress-driven migration are used to explain the growth of slums and informal settlements in large southern cities. The failure to effectively integrate rural urban migrants is used to explain urban decay, right? So the basic points here line up exactly with what Juan Camilo was just talking about, right? The failure to provide housing, to build infrastructure, and so on and so forth, is used to explain why there are slums, informal settlements, overcrowding, and so on in cities in the global South, right? So it's a key explanatory framework. What does urban decay mean? It essentially means the failure to effectively integrate vulnerable persons, which leads not just to the poverty of migrants, it leads to overtaxed infrastructure, inadequate urban planning, informal and precarious work, downward pressure on wages. If anybody has a question at this point, just either stop me or put it in the chat. So just let me know if you have a question, okay? We're fine so far? Okay. Okay, this is one of the very interesting frameworks that we talked about, and I think it speaks to the ideas that some of you were discussing in our introductions. The new economics of labor migration is based on an enlightened self-interest. That is to say, doing the right thing is also good for myself. That's what enlightened self-interest means, right? In this argument, societies should integrate poor migrants because the failure to do so leads to urban decay. Rural urban migration is used in the new economics of labor migration, but also in many other perspectives to explain the dysfunction of megacities and southern cities more generally. That is the idea that cities in the South do not have the infrastructure, they don't have the social safety net, they don't have the governmental and non-governmental capacity to provide the basic and necessary resources that new migrants need to effectively integrate into cities. And what that means is that recent arrivals, whether they're from the same country or from somewhere else, end up somehow floating into the informal economy or into inadequate housing or living in conditions which are totally inappropriate, these kind of things. Ultimately, the argument is that this substantially degrades the quality of urban life for everybody, and at a certain point makes a city dysfunctional in a way that's difficult to address, right? Okay, so if those are the primary ways that people have talked about why megacities and other kinds of cities are dysfunctional, all I want now to say is that it's not simply a fact of quote unquote regular migration from, say, the countryside to the city that explains something like urban decay or urban dysfunction. In many cases, and I think this is surprising that it's so little discussed, so little talked about, but in many, many cases, the dysfunction in the urban form, right? So in the built environment, in governance, in political organization, in social organization, in the distribution of wealth, in infrastructural terms. It didn't happen because of a slow and even migration or even a rapid migration from the countryside to the city. It happened because there was some kind of catastrophic conflict-driven displacement. Now, I was delighted to hear that yesterday's session, Maria, Sarai, and Nicholas all mentioned this. It was fantastic to hear because it's not widely recognized, even though to me, and I'm glad to you also, is quite obvious. Now, when I'm planning a big project on this, actually, with 5 other researchers doing 10 cities in 4 countries. And we had actually talked quite obviously about doing Colombia, right, as an example of conflict-driven mass displacement and the way it affects cities. And having conversations with Colombian colleagues of mine, mostly anthropologists, you know, the idea that one would discuss, for example, informal housing and precarious labor without talking about the conflict, right, seems inconceivable. It's absolutely obvious. But as I said last year when I taught this course, not a single person, and there were a lot of people in the course, not a single person even crossed their mind. I specifically asked the question and nobody even thought about it, right? So what we need to think about is not just the slow and even processes or even the fast and even processes of migration, right? I'll give you an example in a second, but not just those processes, but situations where explosive demographic transition is driven by conflict in a way that leads to unmanageable situations in exactly the way that Juan Camilo was talking about. Sorry, tell me your name again. Well, I can't see it right now. Anyway, you know who I'm talking about. Juan Camilo, yes, exactly. Yeah. Okay, so this is what I think we are all talking about. Now, what happens when people are displaced? And hopefully this speaks to those of you who are conceptual, who are practical, who are policy oriented, and so on and so forth. Think about it in the abstract. What happens when substantial numbers of people are displaced? So the non-governmental sector, the humanitarian sector, let's say, demands that adequate housing is provided. I watched this happen in Berlin when there was a large influx of Syrian refugees. It puts pressure on local government, state and federal level governments, and creates a lot of interesting political energies. Those political energies raise questions about who gets housing. Why do refugees get housing, but not the poor indigenous people or the poor locals, right? In Germany, this led to a very intensive political reaction towards the right, and I mean the radical right, like the neo-Nazi right. People said, why is it that I live in a house where the windows are falling out, but a Syrian refugee gets 80% of their rent paid in a nice part of the city, right? So the political pressures emerge. When population dramatically expands, we know things like infrastructure in a range of ways are dramatically affected, right? Infrastructures are built to manage a certain population density, right? And they're elastic. They're elastic in the sense that they can grow to accommodate a predictable amount of population growth. What happens when that elasticity is absolutely exploded by population growth? Overtaxed infrastructure is very, very closely related to informal settlement, right? When people don't have homes, they have to find a place to be, right? And this is very much, as we know, how informal settlement, at least on the bottom end of the income scale, how informal settlement happens. Now, informal settlement, in addition to, I don't know to what extent you engage with urban planning, but informal settlement, in addition to overtaxing infrastructure, right, and creating problems for security and governance and so on and so forth, it also creates a fundamental problem for planning, right? How is it that you build a well-planned, organized, stable, functioning city if there are people who have created homes that essentially block, right, the orderly development of a city? Now, I'm not saying that there should be slum clearance or the clearance of informal settlement. I'm just saying it's a problem, right? The next problem is very similar, the appropriation of public and private lands for informal settlement. But even when we're talking about refugee housing, right? And there's an interesting research project in Buenos Aires about, I forget the name of the slum, but it's a city center slum, which has been there for some decades, which has now also come to house large numbers of Venezuelan refugees who have disappeared into the informal sector. The initial slum was built as a temporary housing, sort of a temporary housing arrangement for labor migrants from the countryside. The temporary, as we know, becomes permanent, right? Why? Because if people invest their time, their money, their energy, if they have a child or build a life in a facility, even if it's a temporary one, it's their home to some extent, right? And so the temporary becomes permanent in ways that can be quite challenging. And this is what urban decay looks like. And so that is the sort of point that I wanted to quickly make. Are there questions about that? You're okay? I see Nicolas and Juan Camilo. Nodding, excellent. Okay. Okay. So I wanted to show you what the long-term consequences of this are. So is this kind of situation a southern phenomenon, right? Does mass displacement function this way only in the global south, right? In countries that are, let's say, less well-financed or less resourced or whatever it might be, right? Or with, higher population densities. This is Berlin. I think this is last year. And in Berlin, as you may know, so I don't know if you can look down the street, there's this building on the corner, which is a very famous squatted building on Rigaer Strasse. You can see the name of the street right there on the bottom right over here, okay? So in this house, there are, let's say, 15, 20 apartments, maybe 60 people are living here. But down the street over here, you see what gentrification has done. All of these houses have been renovated, right? And so where these people may pay 100, 200 euros per month, these people pay 1,000 or 1,500 or 2,000 a month, right? So the question of gentrification is one question, but this whole question of squatting in Berlin, something that has been absolutely a central element of the character of the city for 50 years, 60 years, is a product of this, right? This is the Berlin central city after the Second World War. You see the kind of scale of destruction. There were 500,000 of 1.5 million housing units were destroyed. This is a very famous photograph of a woman, and this is her back porch. And you can see, though, on the right side of the screen is her bedroom, which also has no wall. This is 4 blocks away from my office, which is now quite a fancy neighborhood. This is 1946. This housing wasn't rebuilt until 1956, right? The contests over who would have access to that space and the emptying out of the city because of the failure to rebuild these housing units in a timely way, right? It created fundamental pressures, right? Which, as you know, played into the entire geopolitical conflict between East and West Germany, and those two places as proxies for the United States and the Soviet Union at the time, right? So things like housing function at a variety of different scales, but when you have radical demographic transition in an urban environment, it generates pressures that are very, very hard to control and that make planning the city very, very, very problematic. So the reason I showed you that first image is to say that this is actually a function or a product of this, right? These two things are fundamentally related, even though they're 70 years apart. Okay, so, here's just a little bit of information or data that I think is interesting. Just this last point goes again to Juan Camilo's point. 700 million cubic meters of rubble. Do you know what they did with it? They built a mountain that was 300 meters high. Right? So Berlin is very flat, but with that rubble or part of that rubble, they literally built a mountain in the city. It's totally extraordinary. And these are the kinds of situations we're talking about. And I guess what I wanted to say is, these are informal responses to that housing shortage, right? So I live in a global north city, metropolitan center, a cosmopolitan city. But this was in the 1950s, the mid 1950s. These were the kind of huts that people were living in, right? These are supposed to be like garden sheds, right? But this is where people were living on land that was supposed to be, a place where you grow tomatoes or whatever, right? This is in the middle of the city. And this created a certain logic for urban development. And in Berlin, what they did was they put up these tower block buildings, which have concentrated low-income people, have generated tremendous social and economic inequality. Those were all built because this kind of housing was so widespread during and after the conflict, right? So again, I was very happy to hear what you, Juan Camilo, had to say. I think it's critical that we keep it in the back of our minds. Okay, so sorry. Can I take questions or comments or critiques or suggestions? Everybody feels kind of hopefully clear on this set of points.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, so Jorge, if you don't mind, would you now email the class the PowerPoint?
Sure, teacher.
Perfect.
I'm going to send it right now.
Okay, so everyone, now Jorge is sending you a copy of the PowerPoint, and it's because, as you will see, there's in some cases quite a lot of text, and it will give you a few minutes. I'll give you a few minutes to look through it, and if you want, you can sort of use a translating device to translate it into Spanish if you like, or just take a few minutes with the text. So you should receive that in your email now. Yeah. Can people just, sorry, go ahead, Jorge.
I've just sent it, and please, in a few seconds, you'll receive the email, so confirm me if you get it.
Can I, if you don't mind, writing me in the chat, let's find out, do people want a couple of minutes to look through the text and potentially use a translating thing, or should we move on? I'm happy to give you 5 minutes or so to do that. Can you write me in the chat?
Sure.
Will you actually write me and tell me if you want the time or not? Because otherwise I'll just move on. Yes or no is great, is plenty, yeah.
It has just arrived.
Okay. So I think we're on slide 10 or something like that. Okay, well, yeah, if you are comfortable going on, we can take a little bit of extra time when there's long text to give you a chance to read it. And obviously I'll be talking about the material as well. So what I will say, the 2 readings for today, and I have 100 more if people are interested. The 2 readings for today I think are really good, and they're by really good people. 2 of them I think are in the UK, and 1 of them is in South Africa. And so I think if you are interested in this material, definitely try and take a look. I do in this session try and work through the arguments in both of those. So hopefully you'll have a pretty good idea by the time we're done of what the essential arguments are. And then you decide if you want to go farther. Okay, so here we go. I told you, and indeed I promised, that there would be a space for disagreement. And what I want to discuss to start with is this question, no person is illegal, and sorry, what is it? Kein Mensch ist illegal means no person is illegal. And the second, no borders, no nation, is a sort of rallying chant of humanitarian and refugee activists in Europe, and has also become quite popular with people who are working in the sanctuary city movement, both in Europe and the United States. So I wanted to ask what we thought about these two statements. And as a beginning point, I'm going to play you a little video. Nope, sorry. Bear with me. Give me one sec. And share sound as well. Okay. It's only
Stress tout le temps.
Só porque eu não tenho um papel, as pessoas nos tratam inferior.
Ficar sem documento é a coisa mais difícil do mundo.
On est dans une prison, mais en prison ouverte. Pour moi, le mot illégal, il est mal placé par rapport à notre situation. C'est comme un criminel. Et je crois que notre cause, il n'est pas criminel.
C'est quoi le crime qu'il a fait pour que le nommer illégal? Sans papier, lui aussi c'est un être humain, lui aussi il a des sentiments.
Quando eu escuto a palavra ilegal, é como se eu estivesse aqui roubando o lugar de alguém, roubando o direito de alguém, o que não é verdade, porque se está disponível este trabalho, eu não estou aqui roubando, eu estou fazendo aquilo que outro não quer fazer.
Nós somos interditados, somos proibidos de existir. Ficar sem documento é a coisa mais difícil do mundo.
On n'aura même pas la possibilité de prendre un verre avec nos camarades, par exemple, et de rentrer un petit peu tard chez nous par peur d'être contrôlé par la police. Ça, c'est une problématique. Ça veut dire qu'on ne vit pas notre vie normale comme les autres citoyens.
Un bête contrôle, il peut nous mettre dans l'avion et revenir chez nous.
As pessoas te olham como se você fosse um objeto, verdadeiramente um objeto. Podem fazer de você o que quiser.
Dernièrement, je commence vraiment à sentir que je suis chez moi ici en Europe.
E quando o avião aterrissou, eu já sabia que eu estava em casa, porque o meu sonho era de estar na Europa e dar uma melhor vida às minhas crianças, aos meus 3 filhos.
Je suis belge, même si je suis un sans-papier, mais ce qui fait la différence entre moi et un citoyen belge, c'est juste le fameux numéro national ou la petite carte.
Eu estou aqui porque eu tenho sonhos.
Eu quero que as pessoas me vejam como uma mãe de família, como uma mulher guerreira que sou, como uma trabalhadora e como uma pessoa igual você, igual qualquer outra.
Comme les autres. Comme les autres.
Parce qu'il n'y a pas une différence être avec papier ou sans papier, il n'y a rien, parce qu'on est tous égaux. Il n'y a pas d'illégal.
Okay, so very moving, a very moving little video. Okay, so now I'm gonna ask you to use the chat function, okay? I'm opening this chat on the side and there's a special trick, okay? So to this question, first, no person is illegal. Yes or no, right? Now, write it down in the chat. So write it in but don't send it until I say send it, okay? So you won't be influenced by anybody else. So write yes or no. And, okay, everybody's decided. I'll give you 30 seconds to decide. It's a big question, right? I mean, it's not like a small question. Okay. All right, let's send it. Okay, I guess that's not really everybody. Okay, no, no, yes, no, 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 no. Okay, all right. So there are a lot of people who say no, there are no illegal. There are no illegal persons. Predictably enough, I think Camilo said yes, there are illegal persons. That's not unexpected, I suppose. And Sarai writes yes. Okay, I'm very interested. I'm surprised. But I mean this in a totally neutral way. And no, 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 yes. Let's talk about this a little bit. Let's talk about why people said no, and why people said yes. And I'll just maybe call on a couple of people if that's fine. Sarai, I'm curious, first of all, to know what you think about this issue.
Well, I meant yes to the affirmation, like, yes, there are no illegal people. So I think there are no illegal people. Yeah. So I know you were surprised, but no, I think there's no illegal people. Like, I agree with the affirmation.
Okay, all right. I realized that was a little bit confusing.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah.
I know. Then I realized that like what everyone was putting, and I probably just misunderstood how to answer the question. But yeah, I think that just restricting the existence of someone and the being in a place or in a country just by referring to that human being as illegal, as if it was a criminal act. I don't agree with that. And as I said before, like, I'm not quite I don't quite agree with borders. So borders intensify that illegal status on people. And
yeah, so let's definitely, I want to talk about the border question as well. And I don't think Johanna, and I'm curious also what Nicolas has to say. But we'll talk about the border issue next. Okay, what about Carlos? Do you have connection? I can't remember. Are you able to say something?
I do have connection. Well, I consider that the matter is not that if there is people legal or illegal, but their actions. What I mean is that I don't think that being illegal should be taken as something wrong, but I think that doing something stuff in a country that where you doesn't belong, that should be illegal. Example, appropriate of the safety systems when you're from another country. I think that that is illegal without any papers of stuff like that. Although the government allows that, I don't think that that should be illegal. So I don't think that being illegal is something wrong or considered.
It's really interesting, the point that I mean, this is obviously a complex legal issue as well, but there's a famous case that's happened recently about the so-called ISIS brides in the UK. They're young girls, mostly who went to Syria, Syria and Iran, Iraq, and they joined ISIS. And they were British citizens, but they were British citizens who had been born elsewhere. And the famous case is Shamima Begum. And she was actually denaturalized she lost her British citizenship because the legal decision was that because she could be returned to Bangladesh, where her family had come from, it was okay to denaturalize her. And the other girls who had been born in the UK and also had British citizenship or UK citizenship were not denaturalized because they didn't have access to a secondary citizenship status. So the point that Carlos is making is actually, I mean, it is one of the hottest, no, it's wrong to say, but it is a very hot question, both in national and international law at the moment. There's a lot of pressure on both sides of those issues. And it's been a continuous question for 100 years. And if you want a historical reading about that, I have a great piece, though it's unfortunately quite long. Thank you, Carlos. What about, let's see, Nicolas, you had your hand up for a long time, sorry.
Don't worry. I think that any one person is not illegal. I think that every person has the right to migrate, to get new opportunities to rise up in another countries. I think that this one is not illegal. I think that illegal, I can consider that illegal are the governments or the international organizations that impose a lot of restrictions to get, I don't know, another nationality or to get a refugee in another country. We can say this in Syria, Iran, Pakistan. A lot of persons that wants I don't know, a refugee in another country to rise up, to have a study, because every immigrant has the right to get a house, a job, an education for the kids. And I think that the legal are the sanctions or the impose that the governments impose to the immigrants or to the refugees. And I think that as Gerson said, I think that the word is irregular, it's not illegal, it's irregular. And I think that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And yeah, Gerson, thank you for bringing that up. That's absolutely right and very helpful. I just want to have us keep in mind the point that Juan Camilo made at the beginning of the class, beginning of the session, when we're talking about, this tension between, the humanitarian impulse, the ideal or the aspiration, and then the practical question of how to achieve all of that. So, Nicolas, thank you. Sarai, you had a comment?
Yeah, I just want to add something. I agree with Nicolas. And I think it's important to have in mind that this illegal status has a bias, and it is regarding race. And racism, like, I don't know how to say that, but really goes through what you think of an illegal migrant or an illegal one. So it's not the same as a person of color who migrates than a white person, and how people perceive them and how their legal or illegal status is taken not only by the law but also by society. So it's not, yeah.
I'm quite interested. I had assumed that nobody would do the reading, but it seems like some people did do some of the reading. Is that right? or is this just your own analysis, which is just so amazingly lined up with, because they're both very, very good analyses, Soraya and
I
Nicholas.
didn't do the reading, sorry. But
You did or did not?
I will do the reading. No, I didn't.
And what about you, Nicholas?
I didn't read it too. It's an analysis.
Well, then you guys are just, you know, naturally brilliant, I guess. So perfect. Okay, I wanted to call on, I know some of you had bad connections. What about Juan Camilo? Do you want to say something or?
Maybe yes. I think legal or illegal condition must be related with your actions and not where you come from or where you rise from. But we must know vulnerability press you to find not always legal solutions. For example, where you are starving or where you see your children starving, you must to find solutions. And I think it could tend people to find solutions in illegal. I think people tend to find illegal solutions. It could be a solution. And I think it's normal. For example, if I see my children starving, I could do anything to avoid that condition or for create that solution. And this is a public issue, I think, because if you want to think in public solutions, illegal immigrants close and formal solution of the job, for example, it could create illegal solutions for people to need to eat or housing, for example. It is my comment about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting to me, and Maria, I see your hand. It's very interesting to me because what you guys are describing is actually almost perfectly in line with the evolution of humanitarian law since 1951. And so we'll talk about that. We're literally just about to talk about this today. And there is, in fact, an empirical answer, right? It is a right or wrong question. Is there an illegal? Can you be illegal? And I'll tell you what it is at the end of our discussion. Maria.
It's just like a little comment. I was Juan Camilo, and I believe that this creation of the illegal, let's say, is due to the failure of integration that we were just talking about. So as the cities and the governments fail to integrate the migrants into the natural and legal spaces, well, they have to find sideways places where they can fit and they can work, as they are in this precarious situations looking for their safety network.
Yeah. So let me ask one more person to jump in. I mean, I would love to ask Johanna what she thinks, but I'm not sure. Don't want to force you to say something. And I think she wants to not answer this question. What about Paula? Are you able to?
Yes, teacher. Well, I think it's very important to consider the incentives for which a person decides to migrate. For example, many times it's because the migrant's life is endangered. It's very important to consider this. I think that despite the irregular status, all human beings have rights. So that is why I think it's very important to consider public policies in each state that responds to social contents of migrants and their integration for within. So it's very well. I believe that integration for all humans is I don't know. I forget the word.
Yeah, it's like a positive goal or I think I know what you mean. Do you want to say it in Spanish and then somebody else can just translate?
I don't know. I think is for my point is about the integration for whole human in all states or countries. It's because when the governments talk about migrants, they say no, migrants or son de otro país. Is like considered to know humans for other person. Eso no me importa, tal vez. Es algo que lo estoy hablando en español porque es algo que me toca mucho. Veo que la gente a veces suele hablar de los migrantes como algo aparte y no considerar que podemos ser esos migrantes o incluso que somos como seres humanos migrantes.
Maybe I can interpret.
Yeah, please. That would be great.
She said that she did it in Spanish, or she talked about it in Spanish because it's a subject really close to her that touches her a lot, and that she believes that a lot of people, when they talk about migrants, they see it as something apart from themselves. They see it as an aliens. In the strictest senses of the word. They do not recognize them as people. They do not recognize them as persons, and they do not give the human value that they have intrinsicate to them.
Yeah, Paula, thanks, Camilla. Paula, that's absolutely a very powerful point. And I am writing a piece on this. It's not done, but I'm happy to share it with you. And it makes a very similar argument about difference and how perhaps it's really a mistake not to identify more with vulnerable migrants. And this is something we'll talk about in the last session that I teach. So sometime next week or the week after, I guess. But yeah, that's a really compelling point. And if you go back to the slide about the new economics of labor migration and this point of enlightened self-interest, right? Some of what you're saying, perhaps more effective than a humanitarian argument in favor of integration and effective integration, is that effective integration actually benefits everybody, right? That might be an argument that is worth at least considering. And this goes to the very practical question that Juan Camilo has been raising earlier as well. Okay, so there is, does anybody else want to say anything, either in Spanish or English? Certainly jump in. Yeah, please. 981. Okay. Okay. Well, then let's move on. We have actually quite a lot still to cover. As we'll see in a moment, if you were to ask, is a human illegal? The UNHCR and the Geneva Convention on Refugees from 1951 would say no. there is no illegal person, right? That's not quite right, but the definition, and I'll show you in a moment, is that it is not authorized by any signatory of the UNHCR, and there are only 2 countries in the world which have not signed the Refugee Convention, only 2 countries. If you are a signatory, it is not authorized in any capacity to criminalize the crossing of borders of persons seeking asylum, right? So it is possible that if somebody was crossing a border without paperwork and they did not claim asylum, then they could be detained, imprisoned, whatever it might be, right? So in that sense, you could, in that sense, a person would be criminal. It would be appropriate to criminalize that person. But if a person is seeking asylum, then it is not in any way authorized to criminalize their behavior. Now, what this means, as you may have seen, there are many people from different parts of Central and South America who are trying to enter the United States, right? And there are many of those persons would never be granted refugee status. They simply don't meet the conditions of the refugee. But because so many of them are claiming that they're seeking asylum, it is not authorized to criminalize their behavior. They should not, therefore, have any kind of legal penalty or legal jeopardy based on that border crossing, right? So if, for example, you're from Guatemala and you come to the United States border and cross the border without paperwork and you are caught, you simply have to declare that you're seeking asylum, whether or not there's any hope that you would ever be granted asylum, right? So in practical terms, it's quite hard to imagine how one would answer yes to that question. I mean, so in practical terms, no, there is no illegal person, as we will see in one moment. Hold on, I was gonna give you a break in a moment. Hold on, let me see where I was giving you a break. Do you mind? Because right now seems like a pretty good time. Sorry, just give me 1 second. Well, the question I would ask is, do you need a break or want a break? Break is up. Okay, let's take 5 minutes. Yeah, and have a coffee, have a walk around, do some yoga or whatever, and then we'll come back refreshed. And now actually the exciting material comes. So, all right, I'll see you in 5 minutes.
Sure, teacher. I have just started the recording. You're welcome, teacher.
Okay, so you all have my PowerPoint, so you can look at it as we move forward. There is a lot of written text in there, but we'll take time to explain it as we move along. So I'm going to share my screen again. Okay, so Okay, so there you go. This is super annoying. Okay. Okay. All right, you just have to deal with not quite a full screen. Okay, so as you see on the PowerPoint, this is the basic definition of the 1951 Refugee Convention. A person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality, is unable or owing to such fear is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country, or who, not having a nationality and being outside the country of his former habitual residence as a result of such events, is unable or owing to such fear is unwilling to return to it. Now, the first and fundamental part that is not here, the Refugee Convention was obviously drafted in response to the Second World War and the massive population displacement that occurred in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. So 1945 to 1951 was a period of massive population dislocation. 60 million people in Europe were on the move in that 6-year period. Okay, so pretty extraordinary numbers. Now, for that reason, the 1951 convention only applied to persons who were affected by the conflict in territorial Europe. Okay, so the only people who were subject to the 1951 convention would have lived in the territory on the east, say, the Soviet Union, and on the west, the borders of France, on the south, Italy, on the north, I assume, Finland. So the point being, there was a very intense territorial focus in this document. What else, is there anything else that strikes you about what is missing from this document, or what surprises you about this passage?
I think, well, I really don't know much about it, but I think it will be missing reasons of gender and sexual orientation, or sexual identity, or gender identity. Yeah, I think it will be missing that.
Those are absolutely missing. That is absolutely right. Anything else?
Maybe that the person needs to be personally persecuted, not only because there's a war or internal conflict and I just want to leave.
Yeah, that is a great point. That is absolutely right. If you live in a conflict zone and you are in the middle of a bombing, there are people bombing on either side of you, but you are individually not being persecuted because of your religious, political, or other views, then you don't have the right, or you are not likely to be granted asylum in this case. The other critical fact, and it relates to Maria's point, is that you have to be outside of your country, or essentially you have to be stateless, right? So this matter of crossing a border is fundamental. Crossing a border, oh, that looks delicious, by the way. Crossing a border is a fundamental element of the 1951 convention, okay? Okay, so there's a 1967 protocol which removes the geographical specification of the 1951 convention, okay? So this is actually really, really important, and it goes to, I think it goes to the point that one of you was making about the issue of racism in the discussion of refugees and refugee status, okay? So let me just read very briefly. Where the 1951 United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees had restricted refugee status to those whose circumstances had come about as a result of events occurring before January 1, 1951, and also events occurring in Europe, the 1967 protocol removed both the temporal and geographic restrictions. This was needed in the historical context of refugee flows resulting from what? Well, decolonization, right? The protocol gave states who had already ratified 1951 the right to keep or to expand the restriction on geography, right? So now there are 147 signatories of the convention on relating to the status of refugees, as I said, right? But there's a huge amount of sovereign power, right? That is, individual states have a huge amount of flexibility in deciding how to interpret the protocol, okay? And that means the application of the conventions, what refugees can expect in different countries varies quite dramatically. And this is always the kind of tension within international law, right? How is it that you preserve the sovereignty of actors and agents while at the same time generating effective and enforceable kinds of laws, right? So the convention is both a status and rights-based instrument and is underpinned by a number of fundamental principles, most notably non-discrimination, non-penalization, which we've talked about already, so you can't criminalize people, and non-refoulement, which means you can't return people to the place that they have escaped, right? So you can't say, okay, this asylum seeker from Guatemala has been denied asylum. You can't then just send them back to that country unless it is deemed to be a safe country. You can only return people to countries that are considered to be safe. Now, here's another space where international law is really flexible, right? Because in many countries, for example, Turkey considers Afghanistan to be a safe country, right? So if somebody applies for asylum in Turkey from Afghanistan, Turkey can send them back. Whereas if somebody applies for asylum in Germany from Afghanistan, they can't be sent back to Afghanistan, right? So this is quite another space where there's a lot of room for play in all of that. Okay. Finally, the convention lays down basic minimum standards for the treatment of refugees without prejudice to states granting more favorable treatment. This includes right of access to the courts, to primary school education, so up to the grade where you're 11 years old, to work, and the provision for documentation, including a refugee travel document in passport form. All right. Okay. All right. So now, in many ways, the 1951 document, and again, the 1967 document. And I hope, I think all this information may be a lot, but hopefully you're seeing how it lines up with questions of criminalization, of racialization, and those kinds of issues that you were talking about earlier. But the critical point is that in 1951 and also even in 1967, right? So the first convention and the expanded convention, refugees constitute a juridical category of person who is considered to be a legitimate seeker of protection, right? So they are considered to be a legitimate migrant, right? This implies immediately that there are others who are seeking asylum, who are seeking protection, and precisely in the way that Juan Camilo was talking about, right? Like people who are seeking to save the lives of their children are still deemed or still considered to be illegitimate, right? So they're the people who are fleeing from what causes? Persecution based on their political opinions, based on their religion, and so on and so forth. Those people are considered to be legitimate. But people who are, as Maria was saying, caught in the middle of a death zone, or who are fleeing to save the lives of their family for whatever reason, those persons are considered to be illegitimate. And this is the reason that if you look at the reading illegal migrant as forced migrant, or forced migrant as illegal migrant by Scheel and Squire, they argue that we should in fact start once again to use the word illegal migrant, because what we need to do in their view is recognize how the claim about who is a legitimate and an illegitimate refugee, migrant, is extremely problematic, because it is so closely tied to these flexible spaces in international law. If there's somebody who, is there somebody who wouldn't mind maybe trying to paraphrase what I just said? I know it was quite complicated, but in Spanish, just so we can try and get on this same page. Maybe maybe Maria or Camilo.
Maybe I'll try, but if you can like repeat for a little bit, I will try.
If you miss anything, Maria, go ahead. If you miss anything, I will compliment. So go ahead.
Yeah, everybody can go back and forth, and you guys can add to each other. But I just want people to get this point about the legitimate versus the illegitimate migrant, that is sort of based already in these humanitarian conventions. Maria?
I'm sorry, like Camilo, it started. I'm like finishing up my notes, so I'm like a little bit.
Okay, I can go ahead.
Okay.
I can go ahead. Bueno, lo que nos estaba diciendo el profesor Avi con respecto a la diferencia entre un migrante legítimo e ilegítimo es que la base, o en lo que se basa esta diferenciación, son en convenciones humanitarias del siglo pasado. Ya se nos tiene en la pantalla que las dos más importantes son la de 1951 y la de 1967. E incluso en la pantalla, en la presentación, se puede ver que en la de 1951 se establece que aquellas aplicantes para asilo no pueden ser criminalizados por entrar de una manera ilegal a un país a conseguir el asilo. Es decir, cuando alguien busca asilo en un país y entra a ese país en el proceso de buscar asilo, tiene que estar en el proceso, pero entra de una manera ilegal, no puede ser penalizado criminalmente o no puede ser sujeto a algún tipo de pena por haber entrado ilegalmente a ese país. Y eso es bajo la protección que le da esa aplicación de asilo. Entonces, por ejemplo, en la Convención de 1967 se incluyó también que, que el sur global, o se entendía que había un pensamiento general, una concepción general, que había muchísimas personas del sur global que estaban, lo que era buscando una migración económica principalmente. Entonces, sí, o sea, se consideró que, o sea, se consideraba antes que aquellos que se buscaban era refugio, que buscaban asilo, así como se consideraban los refugees, se consideraban anteriormente como los legítimos, y los migrantes económicos, que eran aquellos que tenían obviamente este tema de buscar mejores oportunidades y que de alguna u otra manera entraban a estos países de una manera ilegal, pues eran considerados ilegítimos. No sé si quieras agregar algo más.
Sí, era un poco sobre la interpretación que pueden tener los países. Pues no sé si quedó muy claro, pero era como la Convención de 1967, bueno, el protocolo que agrega la Convención permite que los países interpreten lo que ellos consideran como seguro o no, así pues, y entonces el país tiene la potestad para devolver o no al refugiado bajo las condiciones de 1951. Y ya, solo eso.
Okay, thanks guys. Are there questions about that? That sounded right to me, basically, from what I understood of what was said. Are there questions about that? Okay, so let me continue a little bit. This is from the essay itself, from the essay by Scheel and Squire. They say, first, recent scholarship has underscored the impossibility of distinguishing voluntary from forced migration. They exist on a continuum. This was already built into the Geneva Convention, where there was an effort to make all parties happy and also to exclude migrants who were seeking to profit from better conditions elsewhere. A second point they bring up is that a growing, quote, a growing body of literature shows how illegal migration is a product of shifting policy and practice. The boundaries of what is considered legal is continually shifting, and in the global north, it is continually contracting, which is to say that what is now called illegal migration 30 years ago would not have been considered illegal migration, but would have been actually possible. And I'll say a little bit more about that in one moment. But one very interesting point that they make, and that you should, that it might be interesting to some of you, is that there are many migrants who might qualify for refugee status, who choose not to apply for refugee status because you cannot work while you are in the asylum process. Now, 75 years ago, that might not have been a problem. Asylum applications would take somewhere between 6 weeks and 3 months, maybe. Now, asylum processes in Germany, at the least, are running something like 3 years, 4 years, 5 years in many cases. And during that time, people are not allowed to work. Once you're granted refugee status, then you are you are allowed to work. Okay. Okay, so here is a passage from that, or some of my writing, and then some of the passage from the text. So I leave it for you to look at and read on your own. But Scheel and Squire argue, and this lines up exactly with what Nicolas was saying when he was making his comment earlier. They argue that instead of focusing on migrants themselves, we need to focus on quote unquote migration management. And they argue that there is a shift whereby the legal-illegal binary has eclipsed the forced voluntary binary as the governmental grid and terrain for the politics of mobility. It revolves around a utilitarian economic logic and entails the differentiation of migrants into various desirable and undesirable categories. It also implies a transformation of the post-war refugee protection regime itself. Okay, so what they're arguing is that there has been a fundamental shift in the way that status is given to migrants. It used to be a question. It used to be a question in the post-war period, right? So 1945, 1950, 1960. It used to be that the distinction was between voluntary migrant and forced migrant. The voluntary migrant, so somebody who chose to move to improve their life, was considered an illegitimate migrant, while somebody who was forced to move was considered a legitimate refugee, right? Now, and this is a point that Maria made yesterday, actually, that I pushed back a little bit on. Now, the distinction has become between legal and illegal, and the question of who is legal is based primarily on a question of who has economic value for the receiving country. So while I admire Maria and all her points very much, in this regard, I think there's a very challenging problem, which is what happens if countries only accept migrants who are useful for them economically? Does this create humanitarian challenges that we need to be concerned about? And please feel free to ask questions of me or each other. So in the 1950s, the problem was that one problem was that those who were fleeing from, for example, dictatorship in Portugal or decolonization, they weren't included under the protections. But in those times, in the old times, what would typically happen is people would move, right? They would leave where they were, they would escape to somewhere else. They would start by being illegal. They would then be granted some sort of guest worker status, a temporary status. And over the next years, they would be regularized. They would be granted status. As borders became more restrictive through the 1970s and the 1980s, the only way to get to Northern Europe or the United States was either having family there or already, right? Or applying for asylum. Quote from the text, in the absence of other legal migration channels, labor migrants in the 1970s and 1980s had to invent stories of political persecution. So in other words, as the borders became more restrictive, in order to get status in Europe or the United States, people who would just have moved as workers before now had to come up with stories about themselves, claiming that they were persecuted in some way or another. And this created a lot of tension within the whole universe of migration. Some who might previously have migrated as guest workers or as Commonwealth migrants in the UK were in this context better placed to claim asylum. Migrants seeking to satisfy the requirements of governmental procedures often shaped their behavior by appealing to the currency of the refugee as a figure of migration. And this is a really important point, and then I think we'll take a moment for questions, okay? This is a really important point that I really hope that we can be clear about. So, so as you're reading it, maybe I'll ask somebody if they can summarize it in Spanish as well. Okay, so 1967, that convention in 1967, it brought asylum seekers from the global south, right? So black and brown migrants. But because these migrants or asylum seekers were imagined to be poor and helpless, the linkage of economic motives and persecution has been made. And this problematized the category over the long term. Quote unquote. The myth of difference implied a reimagination of the figure of the refugee, who is now imagined as a poor and helpless person from the global south. A lack of political agency became the defining feature of the figure of the refugee during this period. Most importantly, asylum seekers from the global south were also constructed as different with regard to their motivations for movement, precisely because they were imagined as deprived. They were suspected of not fleeing persecution, but making an informed and beneficial migration choice. This gave rise to the myth of the bogus asylum seeker. In contrast to the figure of the refugee, whose defining feature is a lack of political agency, the bogus asylum seeker is conceived as having dangerous or excessive agency, trying to abuse the system, and migrating for economic reasons rather than political ones. Okay. Somebody mind trying to take the key points from that passage?
Okay, I can do it. Entonces, básicamente lo que dice es que a partir de 1967 hay como una problematización del concepto de refugiado, ya que se abre la oportunidad a los migrantes económicos. Y entonces se problematiza el concepto porque lo que pasa es que desde el norte global se ven a los migrantes, bueno, a los refugiados desde el sur global como abusadores del sistema de refugiados, ya que están tomando una decisión informada para migrar por razones económicas y no razones políticas, que es por lo cual se crea la figura del refugiado. Y creo que eso es básicamente lo que dice.
Does anybody else want to add to that? Nicolas, if you're there, your point about racism, I think, is very much part of that conversation about 1967. Are there questions about that? Okay. Essentially, the argument is asylum systems have become so inaccessible that many forced migrants now have to live as illegal migrants. On the other hand, asylum systems have become so repressive that some forced migrants now prefer to remain illegal in order to avoid detention and humiliating treatment. So there's a twin process happening. On the one hand, the process of gaining status in Europe or the United States has become so restrictive that many people who earlier would have qualified for status now have to come as illegal migrants. So they have to cross the border and then disappear, right? On the other hand, the asylum process, and this is what I was talking about with asylum claims now taking 4, 5, 6 years, the process of seeking asylum has become so bad, right? So time consuming, so restrictive, so repressive, that many people prefer actually to be illegal than to try and gain status as a refugee, right? And so that's a kind of incredible process and development. And I think at this point, we should take a little time to have a breakout session so you can discuss amongst yourselves. There was a ton of information in there. I hope it was super interesting to you. But what I'm going to suggest, partially because I need to take 2 minutes of a break to get some water, because I'm talking too much. We take a 2-minute break, and then we have a breakout session for 8 or 10 minutes. And then we have a 5-minute discussion about what we just covered. And then we'll do the final section of the class. Does that work for people? Yeah, okay. So 2-minute break, I really mean it. Let's be back by 7:10, yeah? And then we will we'll be in breakout groups, okay? So actually 4-minute break. Thanks, guys. Yeah, okay, so what I'm gonna do is make breakout rooms of 5 people. And there are a number of questions one could ask. On the PowerPoint, you could see the questions that I had raised were how are borders coercive, which was Sarai's question from yesterday, actually. What are alternatives to coercive borders? But having just gone through that material, which was, I think, very important, but also very difficult, I think it would be great if you could, using the PowerPoint, just discuss that for a while. I'm looking at myself now because I've been working from the PowerPoint, and my eyes get so crazy when I'm giving a lecture. I'm like this. So I wish I couldn't see myself now. So the point is a breakout room, and preferably working through the material that we just covered. And I will jump into and out of your groups, okay? And obviously write me if you have any questions. Breakout notes. It would be funny if Jorge, Camilo, and I were all in one group, and then the other 3 people couldn't actually use the internet. So good luck.
Yes, teacher.
Avi, I would like to know what's your perspective on illegal, on the word, I believe the term used to describe undocumented migrants and migrants who use illegal ways of entry to different countries. What do you think about that?
I think, I mean, I think that borders actually probably matter, and status probably matters, and therefore, yeah, you know, something like illegal is, I think there are illegals, you know, but I think calling them irregular migrants is probably better. And I mean, it is actually a technical question to some extent. And yeah, people who try and evade the asylum process and cross without documentation are technically illegal, right? But yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, I don't know, it's a difficult question. Yeah, I don't know that everybody, I don't know what happens if everybody got to go wherever they wanted, you know? That might be a problem. So, yeah.
Yes, it isn't. Actually, from the technical point of view, it is quite easy to answer. From the technical point of view, you see there is a crime, you see there's illegal activity, so they can be called illegal. However, when we exit our legal framework, our legal point of view, we have to think about migratory paths, about migratory routes, about migrant conditions, and given the fact that these people come, their origins usually are countries where conditions are simply not viable, you start to wonder, is it correct to call them illegal? Is it correct to treat them that way? Is it correct to deport them? I believe that's an awful practice. I believe it is quite awful. Deportation is very, very awful.
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue, and that's why I spent so much time on the conventions, is that, you know, for people who are, let's just call them vulnerable migrants, in the vast majority of cases, it is not actually, they are not committing a crime, right? It's very easy to evade the kind of criminal designation. There are obviously people who don't apply for asylum, right? But anybody, right, could simply say upon capture that they are applying for asylum, right? In which case it is not a criminalizable offense, right? And so, yeah. So yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a challenging question. I honestly don't, I don't think it's plausible to have no borders. Certainly not at the moment. And
I believe it is impossible. Only in certain regions, because, for example, Europe. With the European Union, one has to ask the question: does Europe have borders? Really? For European citizens, at least? Well, it doesn't work that way. You can travel to anywhere in Europe if you're European just with your DNA card. It is quite simple. With the same documents that you go out on the street and take a drink, you can travel to another country.
Yeah, you don't actually even, well, I think the thing is, you know, within the Schengen zone, you don't even need a document to cross the border, right? I mean, literally the trains don't stop, the trucks don't stop, et cetera, which means that if you're inside the European Union, you can also travel anywhere within the European Union if you're undocumented, right? So because there are literally no borders, right, that are enforced. So
no, I believe that the matter in Europe, it's different from anywhere else in the world. The fact that you can travel between countries in such prosperous countries without any kind of restriction, even from Canada to the US, you have to pass border checkpoints. You have them.
I mean, I think that's the thing, though. You know, the reality is that, you know, what you're describing as prosperity is hugely asymmetrical. I mean, there's vast capital transfers, you know, between rich countries in the European Union and poor ones. And, you know, people in parts of Southeastern Europe are incredibly poor by German standards. But there remains no border. And it's interesting, I mean, Latin America has in many ways continually led the way on this question, right? I mean, the Cartagena Convention being one example, but I think also the Ecuadorian Constitution in 2008. And I'm not quite sure what's happening in Colombia, but there seems to be really interesting, weird stuff happening with citizenship and refugees right now. Do you know what I'm talking about?
There's public policy created to give a different standard to Venezuelan migrants. So it creates a whole new framework in international law where you are not a refugee, but you have a protection standard.
Right. Yeah, which there were similar categories in Germany after the Refugee Convention came into effect. It's called the Heimatlose Ausländer, or the homeless foreigner law. Listen, I'm gonna jump into one of the groups for a moment. Feel free also, you know, relax or jump into one of the groups, and then I'll be back in a couple of minutes. We should close out the chat rooms quite soon. I feel bad now, though. They're all talking. Did you have brilliant conversations, I hope? So I was like, oh. Okay. Well, I would love to hear if there's one of you from each group who wants to say a little bit about what you talked about, and then we can discuss for a few minutes. That'd be great. And then we have one more section of the course, of the session, which I'd love to get to. So yeah, tell us about what you discussed a little bit. I know it's been a long session.
Okay, so I think I'll go first. In our group, we started discussing through the work and labor situation. As you said, that now for being a refugee in the process taking that much time, well, first, why do it take so much time, and why aren't they allowed to work? And like the hypothesis we planned was that not being able to work was also a restrictive measure, as asylum seekers are disincentivized to apply, and that creates this segregation and lack of integration that we were talking about last class. And this like kind of migrated to talking about refugee camps and how refugee camps in cities and nowadays are like this way of political failure, let's say, in which we separate migrants and refugee seekers, but also what we said at the beginning of the class of temporary becoming permanent, and there are some refugee camps that have been for decades and people haven't been able to integrate into their new societies. So how like this clash, and we had another question, I don't remember. Yeah, and at the end we were having a discussion which I found quite challenging, is about frontiers which are very like porous. I don't know if that's the word in English, but
yeah,
like Colombian and Venezuelan frontier in which it's very open.
Yeah.
And how can we control that in terms of irregular and legal terms? And that was our discussion.
That sounds super interesting. Does anybody else from that group want to say anything? That sounds like a fantastic conversation. I wanted to come into these groups and then I was like, oh, they're probably having a nice time talking in Spanish and I don't want to ruin it. And so, yeah. Anybody else in there? Okay, then to the other group, I would say very quickly, Maria, that you know, one of the issues that I work on is the northeastern edge of India, the border with Bangladesh, and it's a huge discussion, very similar in some ways to the Colombia-Venezuela conversation, and there is a very repressive, at the moment, a very repressive set of laws being generated to control that migration, and you know, the numbers are quite vast, right? Something like 20 million Bangladeshis are in northern and northeastern India, crossing a border which is very easy to cross. But also in this case, and I'm curious if it's true also in Colombia, with Colombia and Venezuela, whether those borders have been stable over a long period of time or whether they were shifting. Because in the India-Bangladesh case, that boundary has shifted in a number of times in the last 85 years, and that's part of the issue. So yeah, I have some material on that if people are interested. Okay, to the other group. Thanks, Maria.
Teacher, we in our group we discuss the idea of erase borders, and our group thinks maybe erase borders could create problems of sovereignty,
yeah,
about control of interpolitics, control of territory, control of populations. But it's supposed to be, we are in a globalized world. It's supposed to be, we could be able to move all over the world without restrictions. But eliminate borders could create problems of sovereignty. It's like a tension between those concepts. We think about it.
Yeah, I mean, actually, Camilo and I were talking about something very similar. And in the European Union, there are, in effect, no internal borders, right? You can travel from one side to the other, whether you have a document or no document, it doesn't matter. Though, of course, I suppose you can be controlled by the police for some reason. But there are still conflicts about sovereignty. So even though there are no borders to restrict movement, sovereign states have a lot of autonomy in terms of deciding their own political project. So it's a hard problem, definitely. Yeah, we were talking about something similar. Thanks, Juan Camilo. Okay, to the next final group. Nobody wants to.
Okay. So we talk about if borders were coercive. I'm sorry, I think Andrea has her hand raised. She can talk if she wants.
No. Sigue diciendo.
Okay.
Termina.
Say borders were coercive, and the first place, like borders always have armies. So armies are for like excellence, the coercive apparatus of the state, and like so that in first place. And when people goes to borders, they are asked for passports and visa and all that. So then when people don't have it, they are criminalized for like not being able or don't have like the privilege of having a passport or a visa. That is coercive. We can include that. And Mabel said something very interesting is that borders are more imaginary than actual like physical. And she said one example, if then she wants to deepen on that, that would be great. But some houses in Colombia have like their living room in Colombia, like geographic side, and probably the garden in Venezuela, and they're in the border, and it's not like a line that you can trace there. It's more imaginary than actually just divide the house, and this house is Venezuela and this house is Colombian. You cannot do that. And as an alternative of borders, we discussed that being just restrictive in borders just increases the risk of vulnerability of people. And we thought that the actual question and the actual public policy for that will be how do I decrease the risk of migrants, because there always is going to be migrants, and the idea will be to decrease their vulnerability and yeah, possibility to get on risk situations.
Yeah. Mabel, sorry if I said your name wrong. Do you want to say anything else? That's a really super interesting point that you made. Or was that that was fine? Okay. Yeah, there is in fact a very similar situation in also in India where you know, when the partition happened, you know, farmers, you know, there's a story of two brothers who share a farm together, and one lives on one side of the border and one lives on the other side of the border. They live in the same village. They don't know that they are now living in different countries. And they only then find out they live in different countries when somebody stops one of them 10 years later, 10 years after the border has been created, and says, well, where are your papers to cross the border? And they said, but that's my brother right there, and that's my farm right there. And so these kind of things are very challenging. Yeah, so to the last question, that's the really challenging one. What is the policy? What is the kind of policy? What is a policy strategy to limit the vulnerability of migrants, to reduce risk? And I think the critical point to remember is that that is not the goal of most nation states, to limit the vulnerability of migrants. And in fact, I think if you look at the Italian policy towards policing the Mediterranean, if you look at Frontex, which is the European agency that controls migration, the goal is in fact, the primary goal is in fact to stop asylum seekers from reaching not just land, you know, European territory, but leaving international waters and entering the sovereign waters of one of the, you know, the Mediterranean states. So the goal of nation states, I think, in substantial degree is not at all to limit the vulnerability of migrants. And this is where it's really super interesting. And this is where what Nicolas and Johanna are doing, but also people working in aid agencies and NGOs and as lawyers across the world. The work of some agencies within the nation state apparatus is to try and find solutions to reducing vulnerability, right? I can't say, I can't speak for either Johanna or Nicholas, but I would imagine that that project of reducing vulnerability would always be subordinate, right, to the goal of limiting certain kinds of mobility, right? That is to say, yes, we don't want migrants to die trying to get here, but more important is that certain kinds of migrants don't get here, right? And for anybody who reads German, there's an amazing essay about the sort of the extraterritorialization, right, of European borders. So the way that that countries try and stop migrants outside of their sovereign borders, right? So the European border, right, should now really be seen at the top of North Africa and in the Middle East and in Turkey, right? So the European border is not, Greece and Italy and Portugal and Spain and all of that, right? The border is actually Libya and Yemen and Turkey and and Lebanon and so on and so forth, and that is quite telling. So if anybody reads German and wants to look at that piece, I'd be happy to share it. I know a lot of Colombians read German. I've heard that anyway, but maybe not all Colombians. I don't know. No, not all Colombians. All right. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you to everyone so far for a really super interesting conversation. And I just want to say to everybody who's spoken, and it sounds like in your conversation groups, the points that you're making line up really well with what I consider to be really pretty cutting edge scholarship. So maybe it's not that cutting edge if you guys all already know it somehow, but your intuitions and the things that you're arguing are really, I think, are really super smart and interesting. Okay, on to the final section for today, okay? And I'm gonna share my screen. You have the thing already. You have the PowerPoint as well. But here is the question that interests me most. Okay. All right. Refugees are a kind of juridical subject that is central to international human rights law, right? So refugees, like citizens, are one of the central categories of personhood, right? It's really an important category. And for that reason, it's become absolutely central to the way migration is organized, right? That aid is distributed, that that housing and so on and so on and so on are created, right? So it's absolutely a critical question in international law, and it has all sorts of practical policy, social, economic outcomes and impacts, right? So I think we all agree about that. But now let's ask, what is so special about refugees anyway? Keeping in mind the material from the last section, what makes them distinctive from other kinds of vulnerable migrants? And what, for example, is the difference between a poor Venezuelan living in Bogota and a poor Colombian who lives in Bogota, works in the informal sector, lives in precarious housing, and perhaps to some extent lacks documentation, right? Sorry, I just did the breakout room earlier, but now I want to have this discussion with you, and I'm going to give you just 1 minute to actually think about it, because it's a challenging, I think, a challenging question, and one that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and arguing about in my written work. So I give you 1 minute to sort of think about it. Did the question make sense to people, or does that need to be translated perhaps, or it's okay? Okay.
It's okay, teacher.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to break in and say one more thing, right? So one thing we know, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in the next few minutes. One thing that we know is the vast majority of displaced persons move within their region. They move close to home. They typically do not cross borders. Those who do cross borders and are granted refugee status tend to stay on the borderlands, just across the border from their home country. They very often speak the same language as the people who they're close, who are in their host country. They often share the same kind of culture and customs and food and so on and so forth. So with that in mind, now continue perhaps thinking about that question. I don't know how different, if Colombia and Venezuela are radically different in their, the way people speak or the foods that they eat and so on and so forth. But in many parts of the world, it's true that that's the case. Okay, 30 more seconds to think. Okay. All right, let's start talking, because I think it's a serious question, and I don't mean it like as a joke or anything like that. Like it sounds like I'm making a joke, but I'm absolutely not. What is it about refugees that's so special? What distinguishes them from, the poor and vulnerable people who live in the cities where they then also live? If they speak the same language, have the same religion, share culture, share cuisine and so on, what distinguishes them, especially when the poor and vulnerable people in that place also okay, Johanna, beautiful start, sense of belonging. Okay, feel free to use the chat if you prefer to communicate that way. That's totally fine. Thanks, Johanna. Do you think that poor, like extremely poor people living in Bogota feel like they belong? I got a new phone and it literally just sounded like something was exploding next to me. I was like, oh my God, like, holy crap, I just got so scared. Okay. Okay, lack of coverage. Sense of belonging, lack of coverage to access rights due to migratory status, loss of care and support networks. Yeah, care and support networks, absolutely. Yeah, xenophobia is a major issue right now. Well, let's talk about that indeed. First, Nicolas, and then Maria.
Sorry, we are talking about difference between poor Venezuela and poor Colombia. Oh.
Yeah, exactly. What is the difference between?
Well,
yeah.
I make a list. I don't know if I'm well. I think that it's similar to Joanna said. I think that for Venezuela, you can, I don't know, consider that it's a person that here in Colombia they don't have a house. They have to pay different houses every day and keep walking every day to maybe have a house to sleep 1 day, 2 days. I don't know. They have, if they can get a work, it's very bad works. It's explode works, I think, maybe. And also the salaries are very low. I think that it's a biggest vulnerability of their human rights because they work a lot of hours and they have less salaries than the other ones, or maybe than the Colombian people. I also think that Joanna said xenophobia, and they have a lot of discrimination because I don't know, maybe in some news, the newspaper, or I don't know, the TV, I don't know, any one person says that Venezuelan stole a woman or maybe a man, and all the people began to discriminate because seeing that every Venezuelan are going to steal person, and I think that it's very very bad. And I think that Colombian, poor Colombian, they live in an informal sector. They live what they can sell every day with their own stuffs. I don't know, maybe candies, or maybe here in Bogota there are a lot of people that going to Transmillennium, and they, I don't know, they sing, they make some talents. I don't know, something like that. Poor Colombian also has a home. They live in a precarious housing, I think, and also in neighborhoods that are in some cases dangerous, or that are very very in a poor vulnerability. Sorry, and maybe sometimes subsidious. I don't know how to say in English. Subsidy. Poor Colombian people, sometimes they have subsidy of the government, so it's not big money, but I think that it helped them to live day per day. And I don't know, I just want to say another a brief commentary. I think that maybe exists a big difference between refugee and migrant. I don't know what is so special about refugees anyway. I think that refugee is something that gets forced. I don't know, maybe a war, or I don't know. I think that refugee is forced and migrant is more or less like a decision that you take, or maybe you would like to do in another country. And that's it.
Nicholas, thanks so much. Very comprehensive answer. Very impressive. Okay, who is next? I'm not sure, but if you don't mind, maybe I can take Andrea first, since she hasn't had a chance to talk. That would be great. Andrea?
I was going to say that refugees are a type of migrant, and like they are migrants that are special, like the special conditions are violence or political. And I wanted to say that today one of the great struggles of the United Nations Refugee Agency is to consider hunger as a reason for refuge, which is important because like moving from one country to another to seek the minimum conditions of existence, such as health and hunger, I think it's pretty important. And yeah, that's it. The refugee is that condition that is given to a person who migrates for reason of conflict or extreme need. That's
Yeah, okay, that is really great. And also, I think you were the one who is very interested in climate. Is that correct? And that's close, that's related to that set of issues. So I'm excited to talk about that more. I'm not sure who's next, so you just decide amongst yourselves. It's Maria, Sarai, and Juan Camilo. You guys decide who goes first. Maria.
Okay. Well, I think that I'm very in line with what Sebastian is saying on the chat, is the lack of access to their rights, but also I believe that it's the lack of political power, let's say. Like they lost their political abilities when they left their country, and their country's politically devastated also. And with some of the things that Nicolas was saying, and Joanna too, I believe that there is this perception of the abuse of the system, and that's somehow what makes them special, because I see it like in a dichotomy somehow. On a way, their proper system failed them, as it couldn't protect them. So the other systems that are the other states may jump in order to protect them, but the poor people in Bogota that are Colombians are being failed also, but they are not touched just because they are abusing the system. And there's like this communal responsibility between the states of protecting people. I think it's more from that humanitarian point of view.
Yeah, I mean that first of all, I think I put on the Aulas page the origins of totalitarianism, one chapter in that book in Spanish. If I haven't, I'll do it, and it would be very interesting, I think, for many of you to read. It's fantastic. It's totally brilliant, and you know, this is a conversation that this whole conversation is one that I think we really need to continue. So yeah, please, Juan Camilo.
Okay, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm confusing the concepts, but I found an economic migrant, a refugee, or an asylum seeker is the same thing. So it doesn't matter. Not everyone wants, and nobody wants to leave their family. No one wants to leave their land. No one wants to leave their close environment. If you are pushed to seek new opportunities, it doesn't matter if it's an economic issue, because poverty is a result of an economic issue, but it is a political issue too. It is persecution. Excuse me if I.
Yeah, persecution. Yeah.
It's persecution too.
Yeah.
If one country live in poverty, I think it is a system that do not allow to get you conditions to live well. So if you are seeking for asylum or refugee status by economics problems, for me it's difficult trying to find a difference between all that concepts. I think there is not difference, in my opinion. Maybe I'm making mistakes, but economic reasons for migrations are persecution too, I think, in my opinion. I don't know, maybe I'm making mistakes.
No, I have to say that to some extent I really agree with you. And I'm writing a piece about this, and we need to, I think Sarai will get the last comment, and then I just want to make one point about how we'll organize the rest of the sessions, because I think this conversation is actually, excuse me, really important. Sarai.
Okay, so I agree with Maria, what she said about rights. What happens with like Venezuelan that comes here to Colombia, migrants, is that they come from a country or a government where they like don't have the protection they deserve and they need, and they come here to face a country where their rights and their like that protection is also missing. And I'm not saying that poor Colombian people have fully rights and fully protection, because that's not real. And this is a government that have like failed in providing protection and opportunities to their like own people who was born here. Of course, they will do it with migrants. But what I think that comes to be a very a big difference is that Venezuelan migrants keep migrating in Colombia. I mean, they never stop, and that's an issue because they are always moving from city to city, even in Colombia. So once they migrate from Venezuela, they're always migrating here in Colombia, and that's that's a continued process that never stops. And it's horrible, and it's so bad they have to go through this. But what happens with poor people in Colombia is not so usual that they keep migrating from city to city, but Venezuelans, even after doing that and seeking for protection and seeking for asylum, come here to keep migrating. So on our highways, we always see Venezuelan walking in both directions through all the country. So they're moving from city to city constantly. And one more thing about what said Joanna is very important about xenophobia. It's not only something that it's socially happening and that people is xenophobic, but also local governments. They encourage xenophobia. So they encourage by, blaming Venezuelans of robs and stealing and being thieves. They blame publicly they blame Venezuelans, and it's also they encounter a country where not even politicians and people who are in charge and leaders help them. So they're also being victim of xenophobic speech from politicians and from local governments, mayors, constantly. That's it.
Yeah. This is a really interesting conversation, and I actually have a piece. It's not finished, but I'm going to share it with you because it covers many of these exact issues. And my argument tends to line up quite closely with what Juan Camilo was suggesting. But I think it's a really critical issue for thinking about refugees and also vulnerable locals. Because the question of who is included, who has political rights, who is visible, who has access is really an extremely challenging one. I think you'll remember that I brought up, and I promise I'll let you go in 2 minutes. I told you that the average time spent in refugee camps now ranges in the 15, 20 years mark, right? In a refugee camp. And